Why does your stomach drop when your phone buzzes before you even see who is calling? Your heart starts hammering against your ribs like a trapped bird. Your palms instantly slick with sweat. And suddenly you are drowning in scenarios that exist nowhere except in the electric chaos of your mind. Everyone around you seems to glide through life with an enviable lightness, while you carry this invisible anvil of dread that makes your shoulders ache and your breathing shallow. You have become a master of performing normalcy, smiling through conversations while your nervous system screams warnings about dangers that may never come. The weight in your chest has its own heartbeat, pulsing with a rhythm of what if, what if, what if. You are not broken. You are not weak. You are not the only one drowning in plain sight. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who mapped the hidden territories of the human mind, discovered that this suffocating anxiety serves a purpose far more complex than simple fear. Jung spent his life studying why some people become prisoners of their own thoughts, while others seem untouchable by worry. He found that the mind creates elaborate prisons not to torture us, but to protect us from confronting something even more terrifying than our worst imaginative disasters. What Jung uncovered about the true source of chronic anxiety will completely reframe everything you thought you knew about why your mind refuses to let you rest. Your psyche harbors a relentless machine that never stops grinding, never pauses, never grants you a moment of genuine peace. Jung called this phenomenon the autonomous complex, a psychological structure that operates independently of your conscious will. This complex feeds on uncertainty, grows stronger with each anxious thought, and transforms ordinary situations into elaborate theaters of mental torment. The human mind, according to Jung, possesses an extraordinary capacity for self-deception, particularly when it comes to anticipating future events. We convince ourselves that constant mental rehearsal serves as protection. Yet Jung observed that this mental activity often represents our shadow side expressing itself through worry. The shadow, that darker aspect of personality that we refuse to acknowledge, manifests not only through anger or aggression, but through the chronic anxiety that keeps us perpetually off balance. When you lie awake at 3 a.m, your mind racing through tomorrow's potential disasters, you are experiencing what Jung described as the shadow's attempt to maintain control through fear. This is not preparation. This is not wisdom. This is the shadow masquerading as responsible thinking. Jung understood that worry represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how psychological energy functions. Instead of channeling libido toward creative expression or meaningful action, worry creates what he termed a closed circuit where energy circles endlessly without productive output. The worried mind becomes trapped in what Jung called a participation mystique with future events that exist only in imagination. This primitive psychological state keeps you bonded to phantoms, to scenarios that may never materialize, yet drain your vital force as if they were already real. Jung observed that modern consciousness, despite its technological achievements, remains surprisingly susceptible to this ancient pattern of mental functioning. The neurotic personality, driven by worry, essentially lives in a state of chronic emergency, with the sympathetic nervous system activated against threats that exist primarily in the realm of possibility. This constant state of activation creates what Jung described as a dissociation from the present moment, where actual life unfolds. The individual becomes so preoccupied with managing imaginary futures that they miss the subtle signals and opportunities that reality continually presents. Jung recognized that breaking free from this pattern requires more than simple willpower or positive thinking. It demands what he called the confrontation with the shadow, the recognition that our anxious thoughts often reveal aspects of ourselves we prefer not to examine. The person who constantly worries about financial security may be avoiding the shadow recognition of their own relationship with power and control. The individual who obsesses over health concerns might be deflecting attention from deeper questions about mortality and meaning. Jung emphasized that true psychological transformation begins when we stop treating worry as a valid form of mental activity and recognize it as a symptom of unresolved shadow material. To give strength to the channel, subscribe, like it, and turn on the notification bell because understanding these psychological patterns can literally transform how you experience reality. And I want to share more of Jung's profound insights with you. The process Jung outlined involves what he termed active imagination, a technique where you consciously engage with the anxious thoughts without being overwhelmed by them. Instead of fighting the worry or being consumed by it, you observe it as you would observe weather patterns, noting its movements without identifying completely with its content. This creates what Jung called a transcendent function, a psychological mechanism that allows consciousness to rise above the conflict between rational thought and emotional reactivity. Through this elevated perspective, you begin to recognize that most worry stems from what Jung identified as the persona's attempt to maintain an impossible level of control over life's inherent uncertainty. The persona, that mask we wear in social situations, becomes terrified when it cannot predict or manage outcomes, leading to the chronic anxiety that characterizes much of modern psychological suffering. Jung discovered that individuals who successfully overcome chronic worry invariably develop what he called a relationship with the self, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche. This relationship provides an inner stability that does not depend on external circumstances unfolding according to predetermined plans. The self, as Jung understood it, possesses an innate wisdom that can navigate uncertainty without the constant need for mental rehearsal and anticipatory problem solving. When you establish this connection, worry begins to lose its compulsive quality because you develop trust in your ability to respond appropriately to whatever situations actually arise. Jung observed that this transformation typically occurs through a series of what he called compensation dreams, where the unconscious presents images and scenarios that balance the ego's tendency toward anxious control. These dreams often feature symbols of stability, strength, or natural wisdom that counteract the worried mind's catastrophic projections. The individual begins to experience what Jung described as psychological centering, where mental energy stops scattering across infinite possibilities and begins to consolidate around present moment awareness. This centering process creates what Jung called the feeling function, a way of evaluating experience that does not depend on predicting future outcomes. Instead of asking, "What if something goes wrong?" the feeling function asks, "What is needed right now?" and responds from a place of inner groundedness rather than anxious anticipation. Jung emphasized that this shift requires patience because the worried mind has often become addicted to its own activity, finding a strange comfort in the familiar rhythm of anxious thoughts. The ego resists giving up this activity because it mistakes constant mental motion for actual productivity, not recognizing that true effectiveness emerges from psychological stillness. Jung called this phenomenon the inflation of consciousness, where the ego overestimates its capacity to control outcomes through mental effort alone. The deflation of this inflation occurs naturally when the individual begins to experience the relief that comes from relinquishing the impossible task of managing the future through worry. This relief creates space for what Jung termed the emergence of the authentic personality, the aspects of self that have been suppressed by chronic anxiety. Jung noted that people who overcome chronic worry often discover creative abilities, social capacities, and spiritual insights that were previously blocked by mental preoccupation with potential problems. The energy that was locked in worry loops becomes available for what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who anxiety tells you you must become to stay safe. This transformation reveals one of Jung's most important discoveries about human psychology. What we call personality is often just a collection of defensive strategies designed to manage anxiety, rather than an expression of our deeper nature. When worry loses its grip, the real personality begins to emerge, along with what Jung described as a natural confidence that does not require constant mental reassurance. This confidence stems from what Jung called the transcendent function's ability to synthesize conscious intentions with unconscious wisdom. The individual learns to trust this synthesis, rather than relying exclusively on ego-driven planning and worry-based preparation. Jung observed that this trust develops gradually as the person accumulates experiences of successfully navigating challenges without prior anxious rehearsal. Each time you respond effectively to an unexpected situation, you build what Jung called experiential proof that your psychological resources extend far beyond what the worried mind can access. This experiential proof gradually weakens worry's hold on your mental energy and creates space for what Jung termed the natural religious function of the psyche. This is not necessarily conventional religiosity, but rather a sense of meaningful connection to something larger than individual concerns and anxieties. Jung discovered that chronic worry often serves as a substitute for this deeper spiritual connection, keeping individuals focused on personal survival concerns rather than opening to broader questions of purpose and meaning. When worry diminishes, people naturally begin to engage with what Jung called the collective aspects of existence, finding significance in contributing to something beyond their immediate personal security. This shift represents what Jung considered the ultimate resolution of chronic anxiety, the recognition that individual well-being emerges naturally from alignment with larger patterns of meaning and purpose. The worried mind cannot access this perspective because it remains trapped in what Jung termed the personal complex, the collection of fears, desires, and defensive strategies that constitute the ego's survival program. Breaking free from this complex requires what Jung called the sacrifice of the ego's illusion of total control, a letting go that initially feels dangerous, but ultimately proves liberating. Jung emphasized that this sacrifice does not mean becoming passive or irresponsible, but rather learning to act from a deeper source of wisdom that does not require anxious preparation. This deeper source, which Jung identified with the self, naturally knows how to respond to life's challenges, without the exhausting mental gymnastics that characterize chronic worry. The self operates through what Jung termed synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that emerge when you stop forcing outcomes through worried anticipation. These synchronistic events often provide solutions that anxious planning could never have discovered, revealing the limitations of worry-based problem-solving. Jung observed that individuals who learn to trust this process begin to notice a fundamental shift in how opportunities present themselves. Instead of struggling against circumstances through mental resistance, they find themselves flowing with situations in ways that feel both natural and surprisingly effective. This flow state represents what Jung called the union of opposites, where conscious intention harmonizes with unconscious wisdom. The worried mind cannot access this harmony because it operates from what Jung identified as the split between thinking and feeling functions. Chronic worry essentially represents thinking function run amok, disconnected from the feeling function's capacity to evaluate what truly matters in each moment. Jung discovered that healing this split requires developing what he called differentiated consciousness, where both thinking and feeling operate in service of the whole personality. This integrated awareness allows you to think clearly, without becoming trapped in thought, to plan effectively, without becoming enslaved by planning. The result is what Jung described as psychological sovereignty, an inner authority that does not depend on controlling external circumstances. This sovereignty manifests as a quality of presence that others immediately recognize, a groundedness that communicates strength without aggression. Jung noted that people operating from this centered place naturally attract cooperation and support, because their energy is no longer scattered by anxious projections. The worried mind broadcasts uncertainty and invites chaos, while the centered mind radiates stability and draws order from its environment. When you discover this inner resource, you realize that most of what you worried about was actually unnecessary, and that your capacity to handle real situations far exceeds what anxious thinking could ever prepare you for. This realization marks what Jung called the beginning of genuine psychological maturity, where inner peace becomes a stable resource rather than a temporary escape from worry's demands. Jung understood that reaching this maturity requires confronting what he termed the fundamental anxiety of existence, the recognition that life contains inherent uncertainty that no amount of mental preparation can eliminate. This confrontation initially intensifies worry because the ego realizes its strategies are ultimately futile, but this recognition opens the door to what Jung called surrender to the self. This surrender paradoxically increases rather than decreases your actual effectiveness, because energy previously locked in worry becomes available for creative response to real situations. Jung called this liberated energy the transcendent function in action, a psychological mechanism that bridges the gap between conscious intention and unconscious possibility. This bridge allows you to access what Jung termed the perspective function of the unconscious, the psyche's natural ability to sense emerging patterns and potential developments. Unlike worry's obsession with catastrophic outcomes, This prospective awareness guides you toward opportunities that align with your deeper purpose and natural talents. Jung observed that people operating from this level of awareness often describe feeling guided by an invisible hand, supported by forces beyond their personal understanding. This is not mystical thinking, but rather the recognition of what Jung called the objective psyche, the layer of consciousness that transcends individual concerns and connects with larger patterns of meaning. The worried mind cannot access this level because it remains trapped in what Jung termed ego consciousness, the narrow focus on personal survival and control. Breaking through to the objective psyche requires what Jung called the death of the ego ideal, the recognition that your anxious strategies for maintaining safety are actually preventing you from discovering your authentic strength. This psychological death feels frightening because the ego interprets it as actual annihilation. But Jung understood it as the necessary prelude to rebirth at a higher level of functioning. The rebirth process involves what Jung described as the integration of previously split-off aspects of personality, qualities that anxiety had forced into the shadow realm. As these qualities return to consciousness, you discover capacities for joy, spontaneity, and creative risk-taking that worry had systematically suppressed. Jung emphasized that this integration process cannot be rushed or forced, but must unfold according to the psyche's own natural rhythm and timing. This organic unfolding represents what Jung considered the ultimate antidote to chronic anxiety, the recognition that life itself possesses an inherent wisdom that surpasses any individual's capacity for worried planning.